Wild Minds is such a fabulous book. I have been reading this. I'd say I've been binge reading this for the last month or so, but actually that's not true. I've only allowed myself to read one or two chapters a night because I really wanted it to last. So I could have devoured it very quickly, but I tried to make it last, and unfortunately I have now finished reading it. But thankfully, it remained delightful throughout. This is a book by Reid Mitenbuler. The full title is Wild Minds: The Artists and Rivalries That Inspired the Golden Age of Animation. I am a very big fan of animation, and particularly the history of animation, although contemporary animation is very good as well. It's worth pointing out that I can't draw, I can't illustrate, I can't animate, so my fascination is definitely with the history of it and how it's developed rather than with techniques and things like that. This book does kind of touch upon techniques, but it's also about the changing ways in the industries and the way they operated and how technologies were developed and who developed the technologies, which I think is really important because, as the book kind of alludes to, sometimes certain people who were prevalent in the development of animation, their names no longer mean anything. And I think that's kind of a tremendous shame that there are a lot of people who helped to develop various technologies and championed certain styles of animation, and without them, we may not be where we are today with animation. But if you said their name, if I said to you McKay, would you know who I mean? Before I read this book, I wouldn't. And I think that's one of the really important things about this is that it doesn't just focus on the big studios. Of course, it talks a lot about Warner Brothers and Disney. And going into this, I only really knew about Disney. I've watched a lot of Warner Brothers, but I wasn't familiar with the history. And with regards to Pat Sullivan Animations or Fleischer Studios, I'd heard of them, I'd watched some of their cartoons, but I didn't know that much about their history. So I was really fascinated to see how animation began, and it talks about what are considered the very early cartoons, and then takes us through how some studios or production companies slowly started to accept pitches from animators who wanted to sell their animations. Certainly, these were short films, and it talked about how long these animations would take to create and how much patience they must have had. 2 or 3 years working purely on your own to create like a 4 minute short. You have to have passion and dedication. And that's definitely something that I got here. I felt like a lot of these people were very passionate and dedicated about their arts. And then we get introduced to people like Max and Dave Fleischer and the technologies they were working with and the struggles they had to try and sell their cartoons, because even though it was an up and coming medium, a lot of studios didn't know the financial benefit because nobody had ever really tried to market them before. But on the marketing front, I love how it discusses that animation was not aimed at children and how it is actually, or was, a moving version of comic strips. And bearing in mind, a lot of comics, certainly the ones you'd get in newspapers and things, were not aimed at children. Things like political satire, they're not aimed at children. And it's common knowledge that animation used to be aimed more at adults, but it's just so fascinating to think of the kind of things they used to do. And I absolutely love it. And there are actually some pretty dark cartoons. If you watch the very first Felix cartoon, he basically kills himself at the end of it because he finds out that he's going to be a father. That is dark. That is really dark. And the book takes us through this chronologically. It kind of jumps about a little bit where necessary to give us more context, but it takes us through the animation history, focusing on which people need to be focused on at certain times. And obviously, there is quite a chunk dedicated to Disney at one point, and the same with Warner Brothers. And for me, being a big Disney fan, as I said, Disney was my main go to for animation. I've now officially watched 99.9% of every Disney short. I still have a couple left. So I'm deeply fascinated into how those characters came to be and things. It doesn't talk too much about the creation of a lot of characters. Even Mickey Mouse, it doesn't talk about extensively, and I kind of like that because I like the fact that it's got balance. It does obviously discuss some of the issues surrounding um, copyright with some of Disney's earlier characters, and then why he went on to create Mickey Mouse and things like that. But it's not, it doesn't just get to Disney then suddenly just focus purely on Disney. We're still getting in a lot of Fleischer and other artists. It talks quite in depth about poaching, if you like, about how some studio producers would, or animators would poach animators from other companies, offering them more money or a better health package. And that's something I've never thought about before, is how a lot of the same animators have worked for several of the big studios. And I really enjoyed that kind of aspect of it, although it does highlight the kind of grittier, seedier business side of it. Because it's easy to forget that behind the fun, quirky, entertaining animation is a money machine, certainly as it progressed. And it talks at length about television and a lot of the, I guess, criticisms about television when it first came out, and how a lot of animators were very interestingly unhappy that their shorts were being televised. Partly because they thought they needed to be enjoyed on the big screen, but also partly because sometimes they were being edited down for appropriateness. They were being chopped up so they were more suitable for a younger and wider audience. And yes, on the one hand, they're getting to see a wider audience, but there are also financial implications. Selling a package of cartoons to a TV studio is going to get you less money than selling individual cartoons to movie theatres. And it's such a fascinating thing, because nowadays we watch animated cartoons from television most of the time. What I love about this as well, aside from the fact I didn't spot a single typing error, I just want to point that out. I know that sounds like a really obvious thing, but there are so many professionally published books that are riddled with typing errors, or what I consider to be typing errors. They might just be blatant ignorance for grammar. But this one, published by Black Cat, it is stunning. It is so clean, and it is so beautifully written, and it's also unbiased. At no point did I feel like the writer favoured one studio over the other. I never felt like they gave weight to one studio over the other. I definitely felt like this was a fair representation of the history of animation. It's beautifully written, it's very well laid out. As I said, it's pretty much chronological. I'm not sure exactly when it takes us up to, I think, just after Walt Disney's death. And that's not so much because it favoured Disney and decided to stop going on about it after that point. It's just mainly because that's kind of, television came in, the cartoons started to flood the TV screens. It was a strong change in animation at that point. But I will say, if you are a Disney fan, you will adore the Disney aspects. It does recount one of my favourite stories, which is the opening of the very first Disney park, which was an absolute disaster. But I really enjoy reading about it. If you like animation, if you like cartoons, animated films, you need to read Wild Minds. It's quite a chunky book. It's over 400 pages. It's got a good weight to it, and on every page there is some golden information about the history of animation. Whether you're interested in Betty Boop or Superman or Bertie the Dinosaur or Disney or Bugs Bunny, it's absolutely beautiful. You will truly love this, and as I said, even if you'd never heard of Winsor McCay, that name will mean something to you after you read this. Even if you've never heard of Pat Sullivan and the very interesting history surrounding Pat Sullivan's studio, that will then mean something to you. I really thoroughly enjoyed Wild Minds. I'd love a sequel to it, if such a thing were possible. I don't know, a book looking at certain aspects of what was covered in this one. There's a lot of ground that is covered. It's truly, thoroughly well written. Absolutely a joy to read. I'd say it's the best book I've read this year.